Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the YouTube channel grecochess, the channel of the game of chess where we comment, we analyze, and we discuss all aspects of the game of chess. I'm your host, my name is Carter Lin, and in this video we continue the series about the Queen Chess Club Quad Tournament that took place a couple of days ago at their regular location in Floral Park, New York. But before we show the game, the details of the tournament. And here we are. It's called the QCC Winter G30 Quads. What does it mean? It's a Queen Chess Club. Uh, Quads means that the players that were present, they were divided into groups of four. There were 16 players present at the time, and so in quad number one, there were the top four players. In quad number two, there were the next four. Quad number three were the other four players, and the bottom four were in quad number four. I was in quad number three, which consisted of the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th best rated players. Each of us had to face the other three of them consecutively, and each game, the time control, as you see here, was G30 D5, meaning that when the game started, players had 30 minutes on their clocks, and once it was your turn to move for the first 5 seconds, the clock would not move, and then it continued going downwards, and you had to complete all your moves before the clock showed zero. In round number one, I started with a win, but it's time now for round number two. Let's see what I could do. Who's my opponent? His name is Carter Lin, and his rating was 1633. Contrast this with mine, that my rating is 1631, only 2 points different, so this was going to be a very exciting game. But let's see what actually happened. I had the white pieces and Carter had the black pieces. I'm going to enter them, copying them from the score sheet one by one, the moves as they go to the chessboard. And the computer is going to show, first of all, the evaluation. You see here already the starting evaluation. Positive number means white is doing better. You see very small positive numbers here because white starts first. Negative number means that computer thinks that black is doing better. You're going to see which move the computer thinks would be the best. Also the 5 best moves for the player whose turn is to come. And we'll comment on the move, whether it was anything from brilliant with 2 exclamation points to blunder with 2 question marks. See here, game has not even started. Computer thinks that my best option was to move the pawn to e4, the first move. This will give me a benefit valuation of plus 0.35, and that's what I did. And you see this little booklet, meaning that this is a book move. The first few moves are book moves, meaning they have been analyzed by opening theory. My opponent replies with what's called the Scandinavian defense. Pawn to d5, you see the Scandinavian defense. I'm going to take the pawn. And my opponent, instead of immediately taking back with the queen, that if they did so, I would send my knight to c3 and force my opponent to move the queen again. They play what the computer thinks the best possible move, with knight going to f6. Why? They're definitely going to win my pawn again. Actually, not my pawn again. My pawn back. Carter will win it back, but at least he will win it with the knight and not with the queen. I develop my pawn to d4, and Carter is going to win the pawn. I move my pawn to c4, attacking the knight. The knight goes back to f6. Till now we've been following opening theory. You see all the books here, the book signs. And in this move, number 5, I send my knight to f3. The computer says the best, but it's not in the theory any longer. So we had at some point to deviate from theory. And Carter sends his bishop to f5. Here would prefer the pawn to go to c5, so it's excellent but not the best. I send my bishop to d3, develop my bishop, and also challenging the diagonal from b1 to h7. And Carter sends his bishop back to g6, doesn't want to change bishops. Kingside castling for me, pawn to e6 for Carter. My bishop goes to g5 to pin the knight at f6, and Carter unpins it with his bishop on e7. My knight goes to c3. Till knight is still the opening, the developing. We send pieces to near the center. Kingside castling for Carter. My rook to e1 to the semi-open e file. We call it semi-open because there is no white pawn there. There's only black pawn. And Carter develops his knight, sending it to c6. We completed the first 10 moves. In accuracy as a computer, I have an advantage of 1.13. How will I be able to do? Let's see if I can continue successfully. I exchange bishops. I was hoping that, who knows, maybe he might take with the f pawn to open the f file for his rook, but then I would win this e6 pawn, but no such luck. He takes it back with the h pawn, taking towards the center. Now I want to take away the b4 square from either his knight or his bishop, so pawn goes to a3. And Carter sends his pawn to a5, doesn't allow me to send my pawn to b4, or maybe I can send it. I'm going to lose a pawn if I do it. My queen goes to d2, so the two rooks can communicate with each other, the a1 to e1. And his knight goes back to d7. And now I decide to exchange the bishops. Computer thinks it's not the best. Would rather have my pawn go to h4 instead of an attack. And Carter takes it back with his knight. My rook goes to d1 to have control of the semi-open d file. And his knight goes to b6, threatening my pawn on c4. I defend it by sending my pawn to b3. And he sends his pawn to a4. I decide to attack the knight on b6 by sending my pawn to c5. Knight goes to d5. And now I want to create a pawn chain a3 from a3 to c5. That's why I push my pawn to b4. It was very tempting to win the pawn at a4, but I thought it would be better if, instead of just winning a pawn, to create a pawn chain, and computer agrees with me that this was the best move. Let's see back. What does it think? It thinks that sending my pawn to b4 was the best, exchanging knights would have been the second best, and taking on a4 would have been only the third best. And if I used my pawn to take back, then I would double my pawns. This would be the fourth and would really send the advantage to Carter. So I move my pawn, as we mentioned before, to b4. And Carter decides to exchange the knights. And send his queen to d5. What could his queen do there? I decided to attack the queen by sending my rook to a5, and I saw that his queen didn't have too many squares to go. And he sends his queen to b3. We completed the first 20 moves, and let's see what's happening. We are exactly equal, 0.00. This is going to be a very exciting game. Let's see how things would continue. I exchange queens, which is a mistake as a computer. I didn't want his queen to be, look at that. His queen's on b3 threatens my rook on d1, and I didn't want his queen to be free in my half of the board. I thought it would be better to exchange the queens, but you'll see later where does this lead to. Computer would rather have my queen go to c1. I was also afraid of my pawn at a3. So that's why you exchange. But now Carter is ahead by 0.88. He takes back with my pawn on a4, clearly. And now I see that my pawn on a3 is in danger, so I send my rook to a1. And then I started seeing little by little how things could go wrong. Computer would rather have me lose the pawn. Let's see, what does the computer think would be the best? If I send my rook on e3, then he wins the pawn. I send rook to b1, and then he cannot defend, and he loses the pawn on b3. That's what the computer thinks would have been the best. But fortunately, that's not what I did. Because now his pawn can go to b2. His pawn is near promotion. What can I do to stop it? My rook goes to b1, so now we exchange pawns. He wins the a3 pawn, I win the b2 pawn, but look at that. Now the b4, first of all, the chain, a3, b4, c5, not there any longer. The basis is lost, and also my b4 pawn is very weak, and so is my pawn at d4. Knight goes to c6, attacks my rook, and also attacks the pawn on b4. I send my rook to e1, as if I don't have enough trouble with my pawns being weak. I also have back rank issue. If I'm not careful, he can threaten with checkmates along the first rank. And now his rook goes to d3, and my pawn on d4 is lost. We've completed the first 25 moves, and now Carter is ahead by 0.49. Now the question I was facing then was that my pawn on d4 is lost, and what could I do about that? If I put my rook on b2, you see it's attacked twice and defended only once by my knight. And what could I do to defend it? If I send my rook to d2, we exchange rooks, and then he wins a pawn. So I saw that I was going to lose a pawn either way or other, so I decided, at least if I'm going to lose a pawn and I cannot save it, make sure that this extra pawn is a doubled one. So I send my knight on e5. Look what's happening. I'm attacking his rook on, and computer thinks it best, and I'm going to explain to you why. If he decides to take my pawn with his knight, I'm threatening his rook. So if he wants to win the extra pawn, he'd better take it with the rook. But after he takes the book with the rook, I exchange the knights. And yes, he's still a pawn more. He has more. You see the +1, he has one pawn more than me, but his extra pawn is doubled. The other pawn, c7, c6. Isolated double pawns. Still, I would rather have the extra pawn myself, but at least his advantage is very minimal. In fact, the computer shows that he has no advantage at all. At this point, it seems I solved the pawn issue. I wanted to solve the back rank issue, so I sent my pawn to h3. Unfortunately, computer thinks it's a mistake. The solution of the back rank could wait for a later moment. Computer would rather have my rook go to a1, and I'm going to explain why. Because the a file is open file, and you need rook activity, you need control of the open file. He sends his rook to b8, and computer thinks a miss. Computer would rather have his rook go to a8, because the open a file was crucial. I send my rook to b1 to protect my pawn. Again, computer disagrees, thinks my rook better go to a1. And I need to tell you that exactly the morning before, hours earlier, I had seen a video on the YouTube. It is by Nilson Lopez about winning the end games. he's referring to a book by Capablanca, and ironically, Capablanca, the world champion of the 1920s, was showing that having a rook active is more than an extra pawn, and showed example after example where a player better lose a pawn in order to make the rook more active. But what good is it to watch the video if you don't follow what it says? I was too much concerned of not losing the pawn. King continues with Carter and his king to f8. Now it's time to centralize the kings. I send my king to f1. In accuracy, again, computer thinks control of the A file is more important. And king to e7 for Carter. And we completed the first 30 moves, and let's see the score. 2.48, Carter is ahead. He started creating an advantage. For him, it is important, not yet deciding the game, but quite important. My margins are much smaller. I continue centralizing king to e2. And rook goes to d5 for Carter. My king goes to e3. Pawn to g5. The pawn to g3. Let's see what can do on the king side. His rook goes to a8. My rook goes to b3. I don't want any check from a3 and lose any of the gh pawns. His rook goes to h8, attacks my pawn on h3, which I'm saving by sending my rook to h1. And then he sends his pawn on g4. You see here the catch. If I use my pawn to take his pawn, I lose my rook because of the steward. We completed the first 35 moves, and Carter is ahead by 2.01. Instead, I send my pawn to h4 and I block his access from the h file. He sends his rook to f5. My rook goes to, now you see another catch. If I do nothing, then he can send his rook on f3, check, and then win my rook on b3. That's why I send my rook to b2. His rook goes back again to a8, the open file. My rook goes to d1 to take control of the other open file. Perhaps if I could send my rook to d2 and then check on d7, I might have a chance. He checks me from a3. The king goes to e2. And his rook goes to f3 and threatens my pawn on f2. Not only threatens the pawn, but after he wins it, my rook on b2 is going to be lost because of a steward. That's why I send my rook to f1. Computer would rather have my king go to e1. Yes, if my king goes to e1, you don't want to have the rook passive on f1 because by sending my rook on f1, it will become very passive. Computer would rather have the king going to e1, and either way or other, I'm not losing the pawn. Instead, I send my rook to f1. His rook goes to d5. Now he takes control of the other open file, but computer thinks a mistake. Would rather have him do a check from e5. And now my rook goes to a1. I'm winning control of the open file. Great moves as a computer, and now I reduce my deficit to 0.95. This is my 41st move, but at this point we had less than 5 minutes, so I stopped keeping notes of this game. What happened later on is I was hoping that a rook ending could lead to a draw at least. Eventually we exchanged a pair of rooks. We had one rook each of us, and after trying to win as many pawns of each other as possible, I ended up having king and rook versus king and rook and 2 pawns for him. My king had a nice position to stop one of the 2 pawns, but unfortunately the other pawn I was not able to stop it, promoted to a queen, and so I lost the game. After my first win, I have lost now. and let's see the review. What does the computer think about the game? At least about the part of the game I showed, because there is more to come. It thinks I had accuracy 81.9 versus 83.6 for Carter. I played as if my rating was 2100 and Carter 2200. I had two great moves, four book moves each of us, best 18 versus 11 for Carter, excellent 7 versus 3 for me, good 5 versus 3 for me. I had 7 inaccuracies and Carter had 6. I had 3 mistakes and Carter had 5. I had 2 misses, Carter had 1, and no blunders. It's an important lesson what I had watched on the internet hours earlier and had failed to put in practice. That in rook endings, rook activity is more important than one pawn. And second, if you watch a video, apply the lesson. Don't just watch it. But that's what's happened in round number 2. One more round would remain. And in the meantime, let's give a look at what happens in the tournaments. I've been following. Grecochess, nothing is changing. Last game, Maxim Govorukha versus Barak 7, where Barak 7 is leading with 5 points versus 4 for Maxim Govorukha. And let's go to the underwater moonlight. Second round, 28 players continue, 4 groups of 7. Still nothing is changing here. From groups 2, 3, 4, we know who advanced. Group number 1, we have lots of games. Zanilor completed a few more games. Yes, in group number 1, in group 2, 3, 4, we know who advanced. Mebius, PGO74, Mathis B 2008, Chinan Fu, Iraq Lions, Team Rockets, Vivaldi via 5, Lysithia Vantres, and VN Carvanans. In group 1, what's happening? Zanilor completed a few more games. There's 1 point. Maxim Kovorukha with 11 is guaranteed to advance. And then for the second position, two more positions remain, and it's between AMMT, Khaled Kadab, and Zanilor. Three of them are going to advance. But that's it for now. That's it for the QCC Quad G30 Winter Tournament that took place in Queens. This is the Greco Chess YouTube channel. I'm your host, Karilaos Anisidis, and for now, goodbye.